I'm Chance Dorland, and this is In-Depth, an interview program from expressnews.com where you can find in-depth reporting and other resources concerning every topic you'll hear discussed on this podcast. Brought to you this morning by North Park Mazda, the #1 Mazda dealer in Texas last month. And now I'm joined by San Antonio Express News criminal justice enterprise reporter Emilie Eaton for the first time here on the podcast to discuss her in-depth research into how the San Antonio Police Training Academy shapes its new officers. And before we begin, I will note that all of the research we'll be discussing is already available online on our website, expressnews.com. Then the first part will be in Sunday's paper, followed by parts 2 through 5 until Thursday. So that is a mouthful, Emilie. Great to have you here on the podcast. Let's get right into it. How did you and Express News get the idea for this story, which is not just reporting on, I guess, how San Antonio creates its officers, but really, embedding you into this process?
Yes. Yeah. It's been a long time in the making, actually. So one of our photo editors had the idea for this project maybe 2 or 3 years ago, after there was an increase in police involved shootings throughout the nation. And there were a couple here in San Antonio as well. And he saw the need to do a comprehensive look at how the San Antonio Police Department trains its officers, specifically for these use of force incidents. So he and another reporter had approached the San Antonio Police Department, and they expressed an interest in allowing us to, sort of embed, as you were saying, or follow a group of cadets. And it just never really worked out for a while. And then I came on board with the San Antonio Express News about 1.5 years or 2 years ago. And the reporter sort of passed it down to me, and we worked out the logistics. And so we started in January 2017 going to the academy, usually around once a week, but sometimes if it was a particularly busy week, we would go 2 or 3 times a week. It really just sort of depended on what the training entails.
So let's talk about the recruits. How does one qualify for the San Antonio Police Training Academy? I know based upon the research that I've read, there are quite a few different types of people that you were able to speak with during your time with the training program.
Yes. So the police department really touts its academy as one of the best in the nation. And they say that they select only the best of the best. So in order to even get into the academy, you have to be no younger than 20 and no older than 45. You have to be a U.S. citizen. You have to have a good driving record, and you have to have a GED or high school diploma. And then from there, it's actually an 8-step process where they take an oral interview. There's a cognitive exam. There's a background test. There's a lot of different steps to make sure that the applicants are being truthful and that they really are a good fit for the department.
Were you able to find out during your research and investigation people who didn't make it through this part, maybe not of any fault to their own, maybe something physical, maybe something they had in their past, whatever it might be? How restrictive, I guess, is this set of rules that you just mentioned? Obviously, 20 to 45, there might be someone younger, someone older, and then all those other criteria that you just mentioned as well.
It sort of depends on the, I guess, where they don't line up. If they take the physical ability test and they don't pass, they can always try again later. They can always start working out and come back to the academy and try again. If you have a felony on your record, there's probably a good chance you're not going to be able to get in. They sort of list out what type of crimes are okay and what type of crimes aren't okay. For the most part, they all aren't okay. But it sort of depends on the level of severity. And that dictates whether or not you'll get in or not.
So let's get really to the meat of this research. Obviously, what's really special about all these stories that you've put together, which once again appearing in print for the first time on Sunday, 5-part series running from Sunday through Thursday, and all of them right now are available on our website, expressnews.com. So Emilie, tell me about this group of cadets that you followed. You mentioned, I believe you said, at least once a week, if not more, you spent time with these young men and women.
Yes, so it was a very interesting group. There were 38 cadets who started with this class in 2017. Of those, 6 were women and the rest were men. And they came from all types of backgrounds. As you can imagine, a lot were military veterans or had worked in the Bexar County Jail as a detention officer. But others came from, there was a former education teacher who had always wanted to be a police officer, but she was raising a family and it really didn't work out into her and her husband's plans. And after her children grew older, she decided, you know what, I'm going to pursue my dream. I'm going to show my kids that they can be anything that they want. And she joined the academy she was, I believe, 38 when she joined.
When I was younger, way younger, I wanted to be a police officer. And when my husband and I were first married, we talked about it. And his first response was, no. I was 23 years old, and he said there was no way that's what you were going to do. And so we did the whole, got married, had babies. I stayed home and was a stay-at-home mom. Before that, I taught. And then my girls went to school, and so me going and working in school and being with them was just ideal. My husband traveled all the time. His job was the work, and mine was kind of the kids. And it was just an added bonus that I could work with them. And now that they're older, I have one that's 12 and one that's 10, and my husband now no longer travels, I started thinking back in my mind. I didn't really love the way that public education was going. It's still great, but in the special education standpoint of it, I wanted something different. I wanted to do more. I wanted to help more and have a bigger voice than I did in education. And so we started talking about it, like I said, for a good 6 months before I even applied. I overplan and overthink everything. I'm very type A. And so I was looking at it and talking about it and looking at financially and could I make this schedule work and still be a mom? And I wanted to do both. It's real important to me that I'm still 100% a mom to my girls. And so working dog watch, because that's where we're all going to end up, is perfect for me because I can be me at night. I can do what I really want to do, and then I can still be a mom. So that process to transition, it was hard. I had to let go of a lot because while we're at the academy, I have an hour drive here every morning. I leave at 5. I don't get home till 6 o'clock at night. I was giving up all this time I had with my kids and my husband to do this. So that played a big factor of whether or not I was going to go ahead and pursue it. And, again, we kept talking, this is something I really wanted to do. And so I just decided to kind of bite the bullet and just, no pun intended, yeah. That was horrible to say. But just to go ahead and jump out there and do it. And I don't regret it. I do regret a lot of the time. It's hard. I've missed a lot of time with my kids. But it's not forever. And I love that my girls can look up to me. Mm-hmm. And again, my girls know all of these ladies. These are their aunts. This is their family. That we are showing them they can do anything.
Also in the group, there was a physical trainer, a police dispatcher, and a former Whole Foods manager from Siberia.
So yeah, a very diverse group, at least in the stories that you just told me about. And let's talk about the gender disparity. So obviously many more males than females. Is that normal? Is that typical?
Yes, it is typical at the academy, and actually at the San Antonio Police Department, it does not have a lot of women in the department. I believe it's somewhere around 9% or 10% of the department is women.
And so now let's talk about the structure of this. I have never gone through a police academy training, but from what little I do know about this in my own background, I think some of them are a little bit different. Some of them are live-ins, almost like a military training, and then some of them aren't. So this one, correct me if I'm wrong, not a live-in. So they just would show up every day to certain hours for several months?
Yes, exactly. So it was structured 7:45 to 4:30 every day. A lot of the cadets actually arrived far earlier in the morning, either to work out, or some had special duties like raising the flag every single morning. So they typically would be there 8 to 9 hours a day, but maybe on a day they were expecting a test or they were working out, they could be there 10, 11 hours. They also, throughout the academy, they do ride-alongs. So they go out with trained police officers in various parts of the city at various hours. So sometimes it would be the early morning shift, or sometimes it would be the overnight dog watch shift. And they would go out with police officers and actually police the street, and do things, with the officers. The special education teacher that I mentioned, she actually chased down some suspects, she told us at one point, and helped arrest them as she was training at the San Antonio Police Training Academy.
So these ride-alongs you just mentioned, this takes place during the 8 months of training. I want to touch a little bit more on that. If you encounter police officers in San Antonio and they have one of these trainee cadets with them, is it easy for you to tell? Like, do they wear like a white shirt that says cadet on it, or do they appear like a fully employed officer at that point?
You can tell. They wear a bright blue uniform, and perhaps if you weren't paying close attention, you would think, oh, this is still a San Antonio police officer. Because the uniform still looks very official, but it is a different color. And then on their arm, their badge says cadet. So maybe from far away, you can be like, oh, that person, has a radio and has all the tools on them. They look like a police officer. But once you get up close, you can realize that they are, in fact, cadets.
But then you mentioned just now a special education trainee cadet was chasing down suspects. So do they have the power of the police at that point? Like, they're not just an observer, they can participate.
Yes, to an extent. They're basically taking all of their instructions from the field training officer or from the police officer that they are spending time with. So it's not like as a cadet, you're going to just start like running down the street and arresting someone you feel like arresting. You are working hand in hand with another officer.
And so obviously that's all part of this 8-month-long training. Let's talk a little bit more about the daily training that you, at least once a week, if not more, were kind of a part of. You got to view and sort of experience this. It's very comprehensive. So let's talk about the ins and outs of what you experienced.
Yes. So in today's age, a police officer is not just the person who enforces the law. They're sometimes a social worker. Their roles are really diverse. So the training reflects that. They learn how to administer CPR. They learn about racial profiling. They learn how to handle family violence situations, how to deal with homelessness issues. Mental health is a big aspect of the training. They actually spend a whole week where they learn how to interact with people with mental illnesses and how to detect those mental illnesses. So even if a person isn't forthcoming, they can say, oh, that person likely has schizophrenia, and as a result, this is how he or she may act. And this is how I need to act in order to do my job safely, both for myself and for the person I'm interacting with.
And from what you experienced there reporting on this cadet training in San Antonio for the police department, were these other officers who they might end up working with who were giving this training? Were they, professors from local universities or medical professionals? Who are these people giving this training?
Everyone at the academy is actually a San Antonio police officer. So the staff there is pretty big. I don't know the number offhand, but I would guess somewhere around 20 to 30 instructors who have already been officers. The woman who, when we started the academy, there was a sergeant who oversaw all of the training, and halfway through he retired and a woman came on board and started overseeing the training. And she had a very diverse experience. She had been on the gang unit, and various other specialized units with the San Antonio Police Department. So all of the instructors there have a background in policing, specifically at the San Antonio Police Department. And then they also bring in instructors or guest lecturers from various institutions throughout San Antonio. So they brought someone in from the Center for Healthcare Services. I'm trying to think who else they brought in. They bring in role players who act as if they're in a critical situation or a family violence situation or a mental health situation. And the cadets learn how to interact with them, even if they're screaming or yelling or there's a lot going on in the room. So they're getting their instruction from a lot of different people with experience in these issues.
And then obviously when it comes to the training of officers, not only at the very beginning of their career, but, as they continue to be a police officer and serve their local community, something that has been, really out there in the national discussion on violence and interacting with police officers is that police officers use certain techniques to sort of prevent violence from happening, or, when something is happening, to rather than instigate more violence, keep everyone safe, those types of things. So it's not only important to train officers a certain way in the beginning, but to make sure that they continually get that training. So I imagine that the curriculum that you experienced sometimes for this research is probably very different than even that just a handful of years ago, let alone 10 or 20 years ago. Could you talk about maybe some of those changes and some of the configurations that they're trying to use for the 21st century technology and, different things that have been coming up in the news that we've been hearing about day in and day out here in the United States?
Yes, the Academy is very innovative and they are constantly adapting their curriculum to make sure that it does fit that 21st century model. I'm going to give several examples here because this is how varied their job is and how varied the training is. One day they did DWI testing where they brought in family members of the cadets and allowed them to drink in a controlled setting where they were safe, and the police officers or the instructors would give them a few drinks and then they would lead them into the gym and the cadets would breathalyze them. They'd try all of the different tests and learn how the breathalyzer machine worked, things like that. Another day they went to what is called a body farm where Texas State lays out bodies in out in the open, and they study how the body decomposes. And this can be really critical information for a police officer, because if you arrive at the scene and there's bones at the scene of a crime scene, how do you know whether those are human bones or animal bones? And so they teach you, how to recognize those things at the body farm. And then going into some of the examples that you were talking about when in this 21st century model, of course, use of force and protecting yourself is a huge part of the training. So they spend 3 weeks learning tactics about how to, when it's appropriate to use force. And then at that point, what type of force is appropriate? So, do you punch someone or do you use your handgun? The absolute, last resort. And so they do these role-playing scenarios in a tactical village that they've set up. So this tactical village has, I believe, 5 buildings that are set up just like, your home or my home or the supermarket. They're not that big, but, or, a bar or something like that. And they set them up, and they put role players in, or they put instructors in, and they recreate scenarios. And if you get dispatched to a bar fight, then the cadet goes into the scenario. Oftentimes they try to raise the cadet's blood pressure and stress level prior to going into the quote unquote bar. And so they're doing like push-ups and they're running laps and things like that. And instructors.
Oh, really? So not only just the stress of the situation, but before you go to the bar, you got to do physical exercise. So you're literally pumped up before you enter in the scenario.
Yes, exactly. They want to make it as realistic as possible because when you are out in the field, it's not like you're going to get a warning and you're saying like, hey, in 10 seconds, you're going to be in a gunfight. What's really happening is you're running across the street or you're running down the street and there's stress and you're trying to radio in to the dispatcher what you're doing, or you're trying to tell your partner. And so they really want to simulate that stress that an officer is going through in that moment. So in the bar scenario that I was talking about, the cadets would go in there and music would be blaring and people would be yelling. There'd be multiple people and you didn't know who was the complainant or who was the potential suspect. They're like I mentioned, their heart rate is already up. They're already, breathing heavily. And then someone pulls out a gun. What do you do? And how can you tell if it's a real gun? And do you use a gun in response or do you use a taser? So, they do these scenarios again and again and again. So they try to teach cadets how to handle those situations and make those split-second decisions, even though their heart rate is high and even though someone is yelling at them and even though there's music blaring in the background. They want that decision. They want them to be able to handle those circumstances and make the right decision.
So obviously all this is going on, mixture of, on-the-job training when they follow officers around, these scenarios that you just mentioned, the classroom components, all these different things. And then there's Hell Day. Before we finish up, we have to talk about Hell Day, right, Emily? What is Hell Day?
Oh, Hell Day. So this was the most dreaded day of training. You go into the academy as a cadet and you learn early on about the experience of Hell Day, and it becomes so terrifying, and for good reasons. So it's a rigorous day-long training. They start the day with physical exercise, getting that heart rate up. Then they go to MMA style fighting, where they throw two cadets into a boxing ring in the middle of the gymnasium, and they have to fight for 2 or 3 minutes. And as you can imagine, the cadets have become very good friends by this point. So you might think, oh, I'm going to take it easy on my buddy. I'm not going to punch him in the face. You can't do that. The instructors make sure that you are giving it your all and that you are, you're not taking it easy on anyone. And if you do, then you have to go again. So after that, and during those scenarios, they're trying to simulate stress in other ways, like we already talked about, like blasting music or flashing police lights, to make it as realistic as possible for what a police officer is actually experiencing out in the field. And then from there, they did some typical tactical drills about like how to make sure a suspect doesn't get your handgun or your taser. And then they had lunch, and then they went out to the gas chamber. And this was a makeshift shed that the department has set up, where the cadets go through 5 different exposures to tear gas. This is actually a mandate by the state. The state requires that you, as a cadet, to become a peace officer in the state, you have to get exposed to tear gas. So they had 5 different exposures of various levels. The first one, they actually experienced the tear gas for the full, I want to say it was 2 to 3 minutes. And they came out, as you can imagine, crying and their skin itched and burned, and they were trying to dump bottles of water. They all brought bottles of water. So they tried to dump bottles of water on them to try to get rid of the tear gas off of their clothes and their skin. And they were sort of spitting up, and it was quite an ordeal. So they went through 5 different exposures. During some of the other ones, they had to learn how to put on a gas mask after already being exposed to tear gas, things like that. So after that was done, they went up to another portion of the academy or another part of the field, and they were pepper sprayed. And actually, a lot of the cadets said this was far worse than the tear gas, that they would take, I think one of them told me, I would take either exposure to a taser or tear gas any day over pepper spray. They all said pepper spray was just absolutely debilitating. So every single cadet was an instructor, sprayed them in the face, and then they would lead them away. They had to learn how to punch a bag afterwards with a stick, basically, so that if they were ever in that scenario where they were pepper sprayed, that they could still force themselves to open up their eyes and, hit a suspect or do whatever they had to do. So after they had completed that very tiny task, the instructors led them away and rinsed them with water. But as you can imagine, they actually, for several hours, still felt the effects of the pepper spray and the tear gas.
And so not only is this a normal part of training for San Antonio police officers, this, hell day as it's known, it really was a hell day for these cadets, particularly because of an enormous tragedy that occurred this very same day, correct?
Yes, it really was. So at the end of the day, they were debriefing with their instructors and talking about basically like, you guys did this, and there are going to be days, like the instructors were telling them, there are going to be days where, it's absolutely awful, and you just have to have the right mindset and you have to be able to get through it. And so they were debriefing at the end of the day, and all of a sudden, some instructors at the far end of the gymnasium started sort of huddling around a radio. And one of the instructors came over and he apologized and said, "We just found out that 2 police officers have been shot." And there was very little information at that point, and you could tell the cadets were just... they were shocked. They wanted to know more. They were very worried. You could tell they were very worried about, sort of, this is their new family. These are the people that they want to be part of this family. So they left the gymnasium. They changed into their civilian clothes. They went to the cafeteria and they were eating cupcakes for a cadet who had just turned 40 years old that day. And another instructor came in and announced that one of the officers, Officer Miguel Moreno, was expected to pass away.
So obviously, horrible timing. This is hell day for them, and then it really is hell day hearing that another fellow officer has been killed in the line of duty. So from what you could tell, being a part of this training so often, how did the death of Officer Moreno and the feeling that had for them while they were training to, basically take his place and the place of other officers who have been lost in the line of duty in the community or have retired, the changing of the guard, how did that affect the mood at the academy? Obviously, they must have been aware that something like that was possible. They would have been told that and they would have known that signing up, but that was the reality of the situation. And it was just slapping them in the face at that point.
Yeah, exactly. That Officer Moreno's death definitely sort of hung over the rest of their training at the academy. A week later, after Hell Day, they went through taser training, where they were a select number of cadets chose to be tased, and it was really a really awful few weeks, as you can imagine. And then a couple days later, they attended the funeral of Officer Miguel Moreno, and they actually played a role in the funeral where they stood at attention outside as his casket was being let out, and his parents followed the casket. So I think this really... it brought it home for them. And the instructors continually emphasized throughout the rest of the academy, I guess there was probably another couple months at that point, this is why you're going through training, to make sure this never happens to you and this never happens to your family. You need to make sure that you take this training seriously, so that you can go home at the end of the day. So it definitely hung over the rest of the academy, and even actually at their graduation ceremony, the cadet speaker, or now officer, he held a moment of silence for Officer Moreno, and sort of paid tribute to his loss and to his sacrifice.
And then finally, Emilie, before we end our conversation today, I want to talk about how this training that you were such a part of and were able to participate in on a weekly basis, how does this compare to state standards? I understand that San Antonio's police department is actually quite above state standards, correct?
Yes, that is correct. The state requires that peace officers receive around 600 hours of training. And at the San Antonio Police Department, cadets receive roughly 1,300 hours of training. And in addition to that, they also do community service and go out in the community and participate when they are cadets. In comparison, the Houston Police Department is 6 months, as is the Los Angeles Police Department and the New York Police Department. So we actually we have about 2 months more training here in San Antonio.
The reason why I decided SAPD is because when we were finishing with the deployment, my whole platoon, we were like, what are we going to do now? As we go back, because we're in the National Guards, we go back, we're basically not going to have no job. So we're like, let's start looking for places. Then I found in police1.com that SCPD was one of the best ones in the nation. And San Antonio was actually the only place that I had visited as a vacation when I was a kid. I came here for like 2 weeks when I was 11 years old. So it's the only place I knew about in the United States. So that also gave me the motivation to come here. As soon as I came here, I read about the department, and one thing that clicked on me was how amazing the SWAT team is in here. The SWAT team here is one of the best ones in the nation.
And then finally, Emilie, obviously you did not participate in the training as a cadet yourself. You were there and you got to see people get tased or see people get pepper sprayed, but you weren't participating yourself. But that being the case, this was not a typical story. You weren't going to a local school event, or you weren't going to the state fair, something like that. This was something that, we used that term embedded a little bit earlier in the beginning of the conversation. So what was this like for you? Were there any challenges for you, or do you feel like you were mostly just watching other people go through challenges?
It was very eye-opening. I had always heard that the San Antonio Police Department had one of the best training academies in the country, and the police chief has always touted that. But as a reporter, they tell you, if your mother loves you, check it out. So I always sort of thought in the back of my head, I'm like, okay, yeah, the police chief thinks we have the best training academy in the country. And that very well may be, but my job is to actually go in there and find out. And it really was quite comprehensive, as we talked about, just the different things that they subject cadets to, and make sure that they are prepared for any and all situations. I was very surprised how comprehensive it was. There were sort of some challenges in reporting the story. We had to be very careful about how we described the tactics that they used, because as you can imagine, a suspect could find out, how they enter a room with their guns drawn and use that against them. So the instructors were pulling us aside a lot and saying, okay, when you describe this, make sure you don't mention this specific tactic, because that would put us in danger. And then once they graduated the academy, we really wanted to follow the cadets more, and are now officers. They're now probationary officers, and see how their training was put to use. And unfortunately, we didn't get to do that too much, although we did show up at a few crime scenes and got to see them put their skills to work.
I believe at least one cadet during this training did drop out. Was that the only one, or was there more attrition than that?
Well, I would tell you have to read the story, but I guess I'll tell you. One cadet did drop out after Officer Moreno's funeral, and an additional 5 cadets, actually, so 6 total, dropped out throughout the whole training.
So, wow, so 6 out of the original 38. So then 32 have become these probationary officers, as you put it.
Yes, and yes, they're out in the street right now. You might see them. And unlike the cadets, they blend in with all police officers. So they're wearing the same exact uniform. You have no idea that they're a probationary officer, that they just got done with the academy. So you may be interacting with one today.
You may be. Maybe if it's a bad day, or you just say hello at a local convenience store. So that is excellent. This is really something special. So I'm happy that we were able to talk about this. I've been speaking with San Antonio Express News criminal justice enterprise reporter Emilie Eaton. And as we mentioned at the top of the conversation, so this is going to appear for the first time in Sunday's newspaper. It's part of a 5-part series that will then roll from Sunday to Thursday. But if you can't wait that long, all of it is online on our website, expressnews.com. So once again, criminal justice enterprise reporter Emilie Eaton. Wow, job well done. Lots of in-depth reporting here. And I guess now, you know, if you get pulled over for speeding or something like that, you might see a familiar face.
I imagine it will happen. This is a small town, so who knows?
Who knows? That's right.
Well, hopefully it doesn't, though.
Yeah, exactly. You hope, right? But so, yeah, obviously some new friends that you've made, and I'm sure the police department is very appreciative of you being able to kind of, you know, because obviously this helps them accomplish their goal, of people understanding what the police department is all about. And also, you know, if someone wants to be a part of the police department, this is the process that they can know a little bit more about. So great job from Express News criminal justice enterprise reporter Emilie Eaton. Great to have you here on the program for the first time, Emilie, and I look forward to perhaps talking to you again in the future.
Thanks for having me, Chance.
And thanks again to San Antonio Express News criminal justice enterprise reporter Emilie Eaton, who put in a lot of time for these stories. And of course, for joining me for today's episode of In Depth, an interview program from expressnews.com, brought to you this morning by North Park Mazda, the #1 Mazda dealer in Texas last month. For the San Antonio Express News, I'm Chance Dorland.